lecture series held at the Museum of Nebraska History on the third Thursday of every month. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all the Historical Society's programs and services, can be found on our website at nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. Our speaker today is Dr. Frank Edler. Frank Edler received his PhD degree in aesthetics from the University of Toronto. He's written numerous essays in philosophy, literature, and education, notably on Heidegger, Willicather, Wright Morris, and Carl Jung. Since 1993, he has been a full-time instructor of philosophy at Metropolitan Community College in Omaha, where he's the past president of the Metropolitan Community College Education Association and is currently president of the Central Division of the Community College Humanities Association. He resides in Lincoln, Nebraska, with his wife, Mary Kay Stillwell, who is a poet and a Plains literature scholar. And also they have children, Will and Anna. His topic today is the politics of disloyalty in Nebraska, the 1918 state professor's trial. Frank.
Thank you so much. Welcome, and not too humid. Anybody go out last night to Ted Sorensen's book signing by any chance? At the Lee bookseller? Anyway, it was so crowded you couldn't shoehorn anybody else into the bookstore, but it was wonderful to see Ted Sorensen. I'd like to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society for having this series. We can get together and have these discussions and so on. I'd also like to thank the people who've helped me really in the archives, the UNL archives, for an example, in the basement of UN Love Library, and also in the archives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. So without further ado, let me get on with this. The politics of disloyalty. So it is now, let's go back 90 years ago. The trial actually is just over a few days ago. So it's coming up in the next 10 years, of course. And maybe that'll get also World War I scholarship sort of going up again, because I think sometimes World War I is sort of a neglected time period. Jeffrey R. Stone, in his excellent book entitled War and Liberty, claims that the seizure of an American-born citizen, Jose Padilla, at O'Hare Airport, and the holding of him incommunicado for over 3 years is, quote, one of the most reckless assertions of executive authority in American history, unquote. Stone goes on to say that, quote, with a wave of his hand, Bush made an American citizen disappear. This is the closest we've ever come, Stone says, to what might fairly be described as a Gestapo-like tactic, unquote. I agree with Stone in relation to presidential actions, but it is hardly the first time the United States government has relied on Gestapo-like tactics. So this paper is divided into two parts. And the first part is Wilson, war, hysteria, and civil liberties. Many Americans today are unaware of the massive repression of civil liberties that took place during World War I. I wish to describe this context briefly because the so-called trial of 15 professors and one staff member at the State University of Nebraska in May and June of 1918 cannot be understood without this context. As Morrison, Commager, and Leuchtenberg state in the second volume of their work entitled The Growth of the American Republic, quote, in 1917 to 1919, the people of the United States abandoned themselves to a hysteria of fear of German conspiracies and of communist subversion, and the government indulged in greater excesses than at any previous crisis in our history, unquote. With the passage of the Espionage Act of 1917 and the even harsher Sedition Act of 1918, freedom of speech and freedom of the press were thrown out the window, and to make matters worse, the Supreme Court unanimously affirmed the government's right to repress free speech in wartime in the cases such as Schenck versus United States, Frowork versus the United States, and Debs, perhaps the most well-known, versus the United States. It was only with the Supreme Court ruling with the publication of Daniel Ellsberg's Pentagon Papers and in Brandenburg versus Ohio that the earlier rulings in Schenck, Frowork, Debs, and Abrams as well were effectively overruled. The first point I'd like to make is that there was no overwhelming majority in 1917 that wanted to go to war with Germany. Even by conservative estimates, there was a significant portion of the American population that did not agree with well, he was a professor at Princeton, President Wilson, about the necessity of going to war. As Stone says, quote, because there had been no direct attack on the United States and no direct threat to America's national security, the Wilson administration needed to create an outraged public, unquote. Even after the Lusitania crisis of 1915, when William Jennings Bryan resigned as Secretary of State, Colonel E.M. House, Wilson's chief advisor, admitted in a letter to Walter Hines Page, the American ambassador to England, that Wilson could not push the American people into war, quote, because 90% of our people do not want the president to involve us in war, unquote. Nebraskans were sorely divided as well. Bryan was certainly against the war. Senator George Norris was against the war. Senator Gilbert Hitchcock wrote a letter to Wilson asking him not to go to war because the option of armed neutrality had not been tried. German Americans, who were the largest immigrant population in Nebraska, were against the war. So too were Irish Americans. Wisconsin Senator Robert La Follette, during the debate on the war vote, stated that, quote, the espionage bill and the military bill that have been drawn by the war machine in the country are complete proof that those responsible know that it, that is the war or America's entry into the war, has not popular support, unquote. La Follette's point was that extremely repressive measures were about to be passed precisely because the war did not have the wholehearted support of the people. And repressive it turned out to be, beyond anyone's imagination. However, even well before the declaration of war, Wilson himself encouraged the mindset of 100% Americanism and absolute repression of any dissent. As early as June 14th, 1915, Wilson reacted to criticisms from the National German-American Alliance by lashing out at quote-unquote hyphenated Americans. Quote, there is disloyalty active in the United States and it must be absolutely crushed, unquote. Later that year, on December 7th, 1915, in his State of the Union address to Congress, Wilson stated, I'm sorry to say that the greatest threats against our national peace and safety have been uttered within our very borders. There are citizens of the United States, I blush to admit, born under other flags, but welcomed under our generous naturalization laws to the full freedom and opportunity of America, who have poured the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of the national life. Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out, unquote. This is before the war. Once again, on June 14th, 1916, Wilson reiterated in his Flag Day speech that, quote, there is disloyalty active in the United States and it must be absolutely crushed, unquote. Wilson claimed that hyphenates like German Americans were committing political blackmail when they threatened to vote for someone other than Wilson. He then gave the following warning to any ethnic political action. That is the sort of thing against which the American nation will turn with a might and triumph of sentiment, which will teach these gentlemen once and for all that loyalty to this flag is the first test of tolerance in the United States, unquote. After the declaration of war, Wilson encouraged the war hysteria with grossly false claims such as the following, quote, the military masters of Germany have filled our unsuspected communities with vicious spies and conspirators, unquote. A month after Wilson's remarks, that is July 11th, 1917, James Mann, Republican minority in the leader in the House, astonished at the repressive legislation proposed by the executive branch, stated, quote, "The departments have gone crazy on these matters. They see a German spy on every rooftop, on every street corner. And they are afraid of the spies. They are scared stiff, and there is no occasion for it," unquote. Perhaps Wilson's greatest injustice to the great majority of German Americans who were loyal to the United States occurred in the spring of 1918, when the war hysteria was at its height. There were many patriotic societies and leagues in operation during the war, such as the National Security League, the American Defense Society, and the National Committee for America. None of these organizations, however, was as systematically intrusive of civil rights as the American Protective League, the APL. The Department of Justice deputized hundreds of thousands, anywhere from 250,000 volunteers, who served as secret agents to ferret out disloyal utterances, seditious remarks, slackers, IWW agitators, socialists, and pacifists. And of course, I'm referring to the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW. A. Bruce Bielaski, head of the Department of Justice's Bureau of Investigation, which is the forerunner of the FBI, testified before Congress that membership of the APL was between 300,000 and 350,000. It was indeed a kind of Gestapo, a secret federal police that routinely opened private mail, routinely broke into homes, routinely examined bank accounts, and routinely arrested citizens for making any critical remark about the government or even agencies like the Red Cross. Vigilantism reached unprecedented proportions. Anyone suspected of being a lukewarm patriot, especially German Americans, dissenters, members of the IWW and the Nonpartisan League, socialists and pacifists, indeed anyone who criticized the flag, the country, the war, the armed forces, the president, were routinely taken from their homes, made to kiss the flag, sing the national anthem, forced into buying Liberty bonds, at times beaten and whipped, tarred and feathered, and even lynched. In the early hours of April 5th, 1918, a mob of 200 persons murdered Robert Prager by hanging him from a tree outside Collinsville, Illinois. His only crime was being German. As Christopher Capozzola states, quote, "They dropped Prager's body 3 times, one for the red, one for the white, and one for the blue," unquote. The situation was so bad in the Midwest that a Midwest field representative of the Council of National Defense, John H. Winterbotham, stated the following in late March of 1918 prior to the Prager incident, quote, "All over this country, men are being tarred and feathered, and some are being lynched just because the government is unable to take action within the strict letter of the law. These cases do not get into the newspapers, nor is any effort ever made to punish the individuals involved," unquote. After the testimony in the Prager case was complete, the jury took 45 minutes of deliberation to acquit the defendants. Although President Wilson and his cabinet had discussed the Prager incident at length the day after the murder, Wilson did not respond with a public proclamation against mob violence until July 26, more than 3 months after the murder. This is the injustice I mentioned a moment ago. When President Wilson had the chance to use his presidential authority to halt vigilante violence, he did not do so. The second part of the paper is the Nebraska State University professor's trial. On May 28, 1918, the day the trial began in the Prager case, another trial got underway in Lincoln, Nebraska. Excuse me. It took place in the law building of the university and was open to the public with at times 300 people attending. The members of the Board of Regents were the judges and jury, with E.P. Brown, president of the board, presiding over the jury. Acting Chancellor William Hastings filled in for Chancellor Samuel Avery, who was in Washington doing work related to chemical warfare. The university law professor who agreed to function as floor manager for the trial for the board was Henry H. Wilson. In other words, the university provided the functional shell for the trial, while the Nebraska State Council of Defense, supplied with its own lawyers, introduced the evidence against the professors and staff member. There were 12 defendants accused of disloyalty, 11 professors and 1 staff member. The 11 professors were as follows: Paul H. Grumman, Head of the School of the Arts, Leon E. Aylesworth, Professor of Political Science, Clark E. Persinger, Professor of American History, John P. Senning, Instructor of Political Science, Erwin P. Haupt, Professor of Agronomy, Henry Blumberg, Professor of Mathematics, Mary Fossler, Assistant Professor of Chemistry, George W.A. Luckey, Dean of the Graduate School of Education, and H.W. Caldwell, Professor of American History, Adolf S. Rittervolt, Assistant Professor of Civil Engineering, and Andrew D. Schrag, Professor of German. The staff member accused of disloyalty was Annis Chaikin, Secretary of the Nebraska Alumni Association, who would later marry Christian Abe Sorensen and become the mother of Ted Sorensen, who was part of the Kennedy administration. These 12, however, were not the only ones charged. Some accounts of the trial failed to state that whenever a witness was mentioned, a professor or staff member, in a negative way during the trial, the professor or staff member's name was added to the list of the accused. Thus, the names of Harry K. Wolff, Professor of Philosophy, Louis B. Tuckerman, Professor of Physics, E.L. Hinman, Professor of Philosophy, and, yes, indeed, Addison E. Sheldon, who was at that time instructor of American history. Of course, Addison E. Sheldon, very well known, right, with the Nebraska State Historical Society. These two were added to the list. Even if one counts only the 12 individuals initially charged, the University of Nebraska holds the dubious distinction of being the only university in the United States to put 12 or more professors on trial for disloyalty. The charge of disloyalty was made by the Nebraska State Council of Defense 10 months before the trial began. State councils of defense were established in each state shortly after President Wilson signed the declaration of war on April 6, 1917. Their function was to coordinate the war efforts in the state, especially food production, in conjunction with the Council of National Defense. On April 18, 1917, the Nebraska legislature passed a bill providing for the creation of the Nebraska State Council of Defense. Governor Keith Neville appointed an 11-member council whose first meeting was on May 8, 1917. Excuse me. A little more than 2 months later, the State Council produced its first report on July 10th, composed by Richard L. Metcalf, who was head of the Secret Service Committee of the State Council and editor of the Omaha Nebraskan. That was a weekly newspaper. Rather than focusing on what was being done to coordinate the state's efforts in relation to food production, transportation, industry, recruitment, and Liberty Bond drives for the war, the report was taken up completely with identifying 3 areas of disloyalty that included the following. 1, the German-American population. 2, the State University of Nebraska. And 3, the Lutheran Church. Of course, German Lutheran Church. Most of the report was taken up with alleged reports of disloyalty among the German-American population. The paragraph on the university began by stating that although the institution was patriotic, quote, several professors of the State University have so persistently given encouragement and publicly and privately to those who are out of harmony with the American cause that the council deems it necessary and proper to publicly register protest against these practices, unquote. The phrase out of harmony with the American cause meant any criticism, indeed any negative statement about the war, the president, corporate profits, the flag, the Red Cross, the armed forces, or the federal government. Super patriots believed in 100% Americanism, which meant complete obedience and conformity to the government in wartime. As John Hyam has noted, many progressives easily converted their crusade for social justice into a crusade for conformity in order to make the world safe for democracy. Why does that sound familiar? Metcalf concluded the report of the State Council with the ominous statement that, quote, the Nebraska State Council of Defense intends to employ its power and authority to the limit in the effort to suppress in Nebraska any interference with the determination to push the war to a speedy and successful conclusion, unquote. As Robert N. Manley has shown, George Copeland, vice president of the State Council, and Metcalf consistently argued that, quote, the state council, when dealing with cases of hesitating patriots, operated under a higher law than the Constitution. That sounds familiar too. That the decisions and actions of the state council were not subject to judicial review, and that witnesses called by the council did not possess the right to counsel, to cross-examination, or to knowledge of the charges brought, unquote. Metcalf also used the phrase higher law in an editorial in the Omaha Nebraskan entitled, "We'll Fight It Out on This Line," unquote, on April 26, 1917, advising school boards to disregard the state law which allowed foreign languages to be taught in public schools in Nebraska. It is well to remember that Metcalf, even before America's involvement in the war, was not an impartial person in relation to German-American community. As early as January 7, 1915, Metcalf blamed his defeat in the 1914 Democratic primary for governor on the German-American vote. In an editorial of the same date, Metcalf stated that, quote, the German-American Alliance issued circulars against the Nebraskan editor, that is Metcalf, when he was a candidate for office. The German people, whose votes these circulars were intended to affect, conceived the idea that because the editor of the Nebraskan has not always agreed with some of its German fellow citizens upon the liquor issue, he could not be counted on to oppose everything which they might be inclined to favor. As a matter of fact, our good German friends made no serious effort to inform themselves as to the editor of the Nebraskan and his ideas on public questions. It seemed enough for them to know that the German-American Alliance wanted him defeated, unquote. Clearly, Metcalf blamed the German-American Alliance for his loss and for stereotyping him as a particular type of candidate. But did it ever occur to Metcalf that he needed to reach out to the German-American vote and clarify his position on the issues? It doesn't seem to occur to Metcalf that he's responsible for reaching out and changing what may be a negative opinion. By the latter part of 1916, well before any declaration of war, Metcalf took up President Wilson's anti-hyphen plank in the 1916 election and transformed it into the principal editorial campaign of his newspaper. The purpose of the campaign was to eliminate all foreign languages, especially German, in the public schools and all foreign language newspapers in Nebraska. By January 18, 1917, 2.5 months before the declaration of war, Metcalf made no bones about the purpose of his editorial policy of Americanization. He was out to destroy the hyphen. That is, he wanted to destroy any ethnic diversity that differed from 100% Americanism. In an editorial, he stated that Wilson's re-election, that is 1916, was a great American victory. There is more to be done. It is to awaken an old-time and a new-time spirit of Americanism. To this end, we want no hyphen in our citizenship. But we cannot destroy the hyphen, that is, we cannot build effectively upon American lines if we encourage the formation of American citizens into groups according to birth or extraction. That cultivates rather than destroys the hyphen, unquote. On April 19, 1917, about 2 weeks after the declaration of war, Metcalf went after the university. The headline on the front page of the Omaha Nebraskan read, quote, "The Copperhead Nest at the State University," unquote. In the editorial under the same name, Metcalf stated the following, quote, "It is an open secret that in the Nebraska State University there is a thoroughly un-American nest, part Copperhead, part pro-German, from which has come great annoyance and embarrassment to those who would be a bit helpful in the cultivation of the American spirit," unquote. Almost 2 weeks later, at the first meeting of the Nebraska State Council of Defense on May 8, 1917, Metcalf became head of the Secret Service Committee. Here was a person who already had a grudge against the German vote in Nebraska and wanted to eliminate foreign languages in schools and foreign language newspapers from the state, and who also saw the university as harboring a nest of disloyal professors. Indeed, a person who believed that one was either 100% American or one was a traitor. It is not surprising that the first report of the Nebraska State Council of Defense on July 10th focused exclusively on suspected areas of disloyalty rather than on ways to coordinate the state's efforts and mobilize the public sentiment in support of the war. Without a doubt, Metcalf's mention of an un-American nest at the university was a reference to the anti-war faction of the faculty. As war approached, tensions were running high at the university between the pro-war and anti-war factions. Of course, you remember that we had, a period of 3 years of neutrality where tensions built up. At the end of March, the pro-war faction sent a petition of 42 faculty signatures, including Chancellor Avery, to President Wilson and the members of Congress of Nebraska. The petition read as follows, quote, "We stand for unqualified support of the administration and for defense of international integrity and solidarity in all events. Pacifism is untimely and dangerous," unquote. In response to this, the anti-war group, followed by circulating and sending its own petition to President Wilson and the Nebraska delegation in Congress, which read as follows, quote, "We, the undersigned members of the faculty of the University of Nebraska, urge upon Congress that it follow the precedent of the Congress of 1798 to 1800 in its dealings with French depredations upon American commerce, by contenting itself with preparations for defense and measures calculated to defend our commerce, and that it use all honorable means of preventing American aggressive participation in the present European conflict," unquote. The petition was signed by 99 professors and staff members. Clearly, the anti-war faction wanted President Wilson to employ the option of arming merchant vessels and using the Navy to defend U.S. merchant ships against German submarines. The main focus of Metcalf's ire in his editorial on the Copperhead Nest at the university was Clark E. Persinger, professor of American history. Not only was Persinger one of the signatories to the anti-war petition, he also had the audacity to continue to send letters to newspaper editors after the war had been declared. In his letter to the editor of the Nebraska State Journal on April 7th, Persinger readily admitted that the, quote, "the signers of the anti-war petition stand ready now that the war has been decided upon to do whatever is necessary for the carrying out of the war to a successful conclusion." But he also claimed the right to criticize, quote, "leaders of the extreme, quote unquote, war for self-respect party at the university." Quote, "The war against extremists must go on even during war. Otherwise, democracy will emerge from the war the loser instead of, as we now hope, the gainer," unquote. In the same issue, Metcalf responded to the question of free speech in the following way, quote, "As a matter of fact, the free speech principle does not enter into this affair. At this time, a man is either 100% American or he is not worthy of the name. The important thing now is for every man and woman to be wholly and entirely American. Nothing else is of any consequence whatever," unquote. This statement is nothing short of stunning. What Metcalf was saying was that freedom of speech was irrelevant and that it did not even merit consideration in the present crisis. Clearly, freedom of speech was not something of consequence. Thus, for all intents and purposes, freedom of speech no longer existed. Total conformity as a 100% American was more important than free speech. His obsession with loyalty stems from the fact that he thought Nebraska could not achieve 100% production unless everyone was 100% American. He did not seem to understand that one could cultivate a foreign tradition and a foreign language and still be a patriotic American. Metcalf concluded his April 19th editorial with the following words: "The people of Nebraska must meet this issue. The copperhead Kaiser snake in the Nebraska University cannot be scotched any time too soon. If this professor, that is Persinger, is depending on men higher up to protect him in his un-American course, the people will want to learn the identity of the higher-ups. In the meantime, scotch the snake of copperheadism. Chancellor Avery, "Scotch the snake. The people of Nebraska will support you," unquote. Thus, Metcalf was bent on a course of ferreting out disloyalty at the university well before the State Council had its first meeting on May 8, 1917. There's also a political dimension to Metcalf's 100% Americanism that needs to be mentioned. Lee Metcalf, Richard L. Metcalf's son, had been selected as Governor Keith Neville's private secretary. William J. Breen, in his work Uncle Sam at Home, quotes from the Midwest Representative's confidential report to the Council of National Defense on October 2nd, 1917, stating that, quote, "In Nebraska, the governor appointed a state council made up entirely of Democrats, not one well-known influential Republican being on the committee," unquote. Super patriots who used their popularity to political advantage were called at times patrioteers. Robert L. Manley quotes Christian A. Sorensen, who claimed that, quote, "The whole investigation," that is, the university trial, "was an attempt on the part of Governor Neville, Metcalf, Richmond, and Copeland to make political capital," unquote. Will Owen Jones, editor of the Nebraska State Journal in Lincoln, was one of the few newspaper editors who consistently opposed Metcalf and the State Council in their view that 100% Americanism demanded complete editorial conformity to and support of Wilson's policies, and that the State Council was above the law. About a week after the July 10th report of the State Council identifying areas of disloyalty in Nebraska, Jones, in an editorial under the heading "Keeping of Heads," warned against the loss of calmness and balance. Quote, "We can't upset Germany while we ourselves are upset. Some ominous manifestations of lost balance have occurred in connection with labor disturbances," right? He's talking about the IWW deportations in Bisbee, Arizona. "While wiping away with one hand tears of sympathy for Belgians deported by Germans, Americans in Missouri and Arizona have been deporting other Americans whose presence they resented. Another expression of perilous excitability is found in the traitor hunt, in which a good many persons acting as self-appointed custodians of their neighbor's loyalty are acting as policeman, judge, and jury, filing upon the circumambient air their verdicts of first-degree treason. Here is our friend Metcalf of Omaha, launching patriotic bulls as from a machine gun, and excommunicating such individuals as happen not to subscribe to his particular and peculiar creed of patriotism," unquote. The next day, July 19th, Jones, under the column heading "More or Less Personal," continued his attack on the super patriot Metcalf. Quote, "The belligerency of Richard L. Metcalf and his zeal in running down quote-unquote traitors surprises no one who has watched his newspaper, the Omaha Nebraskan, during the last year or two. Mr. Metcalf adopted a vigorous anti-German policy when this country was still neutral," unquote. This started an editorial feud between Metcalf and Jones that would last the duration of the war. Metcalf attacked anyone who criticized his super-patriotism, including the Board of Regents of the university. When Frank L. Haller, or Haller, I'm not quite sure, I know sometimes it's pronounced Haller. When Frank L. Haller, the newly elected president of the Board of Regents, criticized Metcalf's claim that some of the university faculty were disloyal, Metcalf attacked Haller with a vengeance. For nearly a whole month of August in 1917, and even several months thereafter, Nebraska newspapers were abuzz with Metcalf's claim that Frank L. Haller was the infamous Patricia Newcomb, who had written numerous pro-German letters to editors of Nebraska newspapers, notably the Omaha World Herald. Metcalf devoted the whole August 2nd issue of the Omaha Nebraskan trying to prove Haller was Patricia Newcomb. The banner headline and subheads took up half the front page of the Omaha Nebraskan and screamed, quote, why Frank L. Haller should resign, unquote. It was clear that Metcalf was pursuing the identity of the higher-ups in the university administration who were supposedly protecting the nest of Copperheads and pro-Germans. At the August 14, 1917 meeting of the State Council of Defense, Metcalf proposed a resolution that Frank L. Haller either, quote, clear himself of charges publicly made against him or resign his office as a member of the Board of Regents of the University of Nebraska, unquote. According to the minutes, Governor Neville, who was present, quote, did not consider the resolution in any wise unfair to Mr. Haller, but went on to say that, quote, it would be impossible for the author of the Patricia Newcomb letters to reverse his position in a short time and be loyal to the government, unquote. In other words, it was fair to give him a chance to clear himself, but he was already guilty. To this day, one of the great excuse me. To this day, one of the great mysteries of Nebraska history is whether Frank L. Haller was indeed Patricia Newcomb. Metcalf started his newspaper campaign against Haller shortly after Haller had gone on vacation. Given the climate of war hysteria, Haller may have felt that the damage done could not be reversed by the time he returned. At the August 14th meeting of the State Council, Dr. Weber, a member of the council, quote, stated that a sentiment against Mr. Haller was growing rapidly and that many people would withhold their children from the university as long as Mr. Haller remained as the head of the Board of Regents, unquote. Haller himself never denied the charges publicly, and he stepped down as president of the board on December 11, 1917. As early as October 3rd, however, Chancellor Avery stated in a letter to Metcalf that, quote, while I do not wish to be publicly quoted in the matter, I have it authoritatively that Mr. Haller will retire from the presidency of the board on December 11th, unquote. Haller did indeed resign on December 11th. He was still a member of the board, but he attended no further meetings. The board lost its staunchest member who tried to defend the university's tradition of academic freedom. With Haller gone, E.G. Brown was elected to the position and proved to be more conciliatory to the State Council than Haller had been. Brown and a number of other board members had initially defended Haller, but they retreated when the publicity became too intense, and Haller failed to defend himself against the Patricia Newcomb charge. In the grip of war hysteria, many thought that any professor, even suspected of making critical utterances about President Wilson, the war, Liberty Bonds, the Red Cross, the British, or having a pro-German attitude, should be summarily fired. As Clifford Cox has shown, the University of Michigan Board of Regents summarily fired Dr. Carl E. Eggert in the German department on the basis of mere accusations claiming he had made pro-German remarks. As Wilcox says, quote, no actual proof was produced to substantiate the affidavits, and, quote, the authors were not required to be present nor to submit to cross-examination, unquote. Michigan went on to discharge 5 other professors of German. These professors were guilty simply by accusation. The same hysteria was evident in an editorial in the Lincoln Daily Star shortly before the professor's trial started at the University of Nebraska. The editorial, under the title Bona Fide Evidence, referring to the accusations of disloyalty gathered by the State Council of Defense against 11 professors and 1 staff member, stated the following, quote, the Defense Council has pointed out the cancer in the University of Nebraska, and the Board of Regents, as loyal and true Americans, owe it to their country to rid the institution of the disease. The Council has left no loophole for pifflish delay or evasion of the issue. The way is made plain. The only solution is the immediate removal of this sickening display of faint-hearted and adulterated patriotism, unquote. It must be stated to the credit of the Board of Regents that at least they stood firm in their demand for a trial open to the public and thus did not take the expedient option of issuing summary dismissals based on mere accusations like the University of Michigan. However, I agree with Robert Knoll's characterization of the trial as a witch hunt. Interestingly, the State Council, at its March 20th, 1918 meeting, passed a resolution that, quote, a committee of 3 consisting of Dr. Weber, Mr. Copeland, and Mr. Johnson be appointed to obtain all possible information pertaining to the attitude towards the government of all professors of the University of Nebraska. Clearly, the State Council was now targeting all professors and gearing up for a confrontation with the university. The incident that stirred up a hornet's nest was a report by the Patriotic League of the university concerning its Finance Committee meeting of April 8th, 1918. The Finance Committee had met for the purpose of soliciting subscriptions for the Third Liberty Loan in University Hall. When the matter of the Lutheran ministers who were being denounced came up, Professor Clark Persinger, who was a member of the Finance Committee, expressed his sympathy with them. Other members of the Finance Committee condemned Persinger's view. Professor Minniethrope England was said to have remarked that Persinger had not changed his views since the beginning of the war, and Persinger replied that he had not. The report made by the Executive Committee of the Patriotic League about the incident found its way to the State Council of Defense. This latest report of alleged disloyalty on Persinger's part, along with the State Council's intention on March 20th to investigate all professors at the university, brought everything to a head. On April 19th, 1918, the State Council sent a letter to the Board of Regents that began with the following words, quote, during the last 10 months, many reports and complaints have reached the State Council of Defense with regards to the un-American attitude of persons connected with the university. Some of these reports show a decidedly pro-German sympathy, others an attitude of mind out of harmony with the supreme purpose of the nation in its war work. Members of the Patriotic League of the university have been rebuffed and sneered at by those who fail to outwardly and wholeheartedly support their government in the most tremendous crisis of its history, unquote. The letter included a copy of the report of the Patriotic League and singled out the Department of History, American History, of which Persinger was a member, and the Graduate School of Education for particular censure. Excuse me. Both lacked, quote, virile American leadership, unquote, and were tainted with, quote, a spirit of philosophical pacifism, unquote. Moreover, academic freedom, quote, should be severely frowned upon and dealt with because, quote, Nebraska's leading educational institution should and must be 100% aggressively American. Behavior which is negative, halting, and hesitating by anyone on the university staff in support of the government should not be tolerated and should be made impossible, unquote. The letter closed by urging the Board of Regents to follow the example of other universities. Quote, the boards of many universities and colleges of the country have taken vigorous action to purge themselves of such pernicious influences, unquote. In other words, the accused professors should simply be dismissed summarily. Since the State Council did not want to conduct a trial of its own, it had to agree to the board's demands that the trial be made public and the accused professors have the right to defend themselves. It is clear from a letter that E.P. Brown, the board president, sent to the State Council on April 25th, 1918. Quote, the board is in receipt of letters from officers, teachers, and friends of the university and from some of the persons accused in your letter of not being aggressively American, asking for a hearing in regard to these matters. The general public is also entitled to be informed and enabled to reach sound conclusions upon them. The Board of Regents has concluded that in view of the above and of the publication of your letter, that's the April 19th letter, and the wide circulation given it, a public hearing should be called and the State Council of Defense asked to submit any evidence it may have bearing upon the matters involved. Any person accused should be given the opportunity to be heard in his own defense, unquote. Although Brown indicated that the board wanted to cooperate with the State Council, He also stated that, quote, this board cannot proceed to take definite action upon anonymous reports and complaints, unquote. More importantly, Brown's letter states for the first time the criteria that the board would use as a basis of any dismissal. Quote, any person upon such a hearing shall be shown to have said, taught, or advised anything which can fairly be said to interfere in any way with the carrying on of the struggle in which the country is engaged, or have given aid to or comfort to its enemies at home or abroad, or whose behavior is negative, halting, or hesitating in support of the government shall be summarily dismissed from the service of the university, unquote. Clearly, the board now wanted to own this trial, and in order to eliminate any perception the public might have of a disloyal university, the board not only opened the trial to any additional public accusation, but also included criteria for both active and passive disloyalty. That is, from the active disloyalty of treason and sedition to the passive disloyalty of hesitating behavior in support of the government. The board went even further. The letter stated that, quote, if it can be shown that any employee of the institution has failed to do his part whenever called upon in the present struggle, whatever position such employee may fill shall at once be vacated and a loyal successor appointed. But what would it mean for an employee of the university to have failed to do his part whenever called upon in the present struggle? This is so vague as to include almost anything. It is as though the board were now trying to outdo the state council in its attempt to purge the university of even the slightest taint of disloyalty. This, however, is exactly what the board requested Henry H. Wilson to do as manager of the trial. What is absolutely breathtaking in all this is that Wilson's letter to the board, in which he accepts the board's request to be manager on behalf of the board, is dated May 27th, 1918. That is the day before the trial started. How on earth could Wilson have possibly been prepared to manage this trial if he accepted the position the day before the trial? As I shall point out, Wilson was woefully unprepared to conduct or manage this trial. In his letter of acceptance, Wilson enclosed a set of principles and rules of procedure for the trial. This letter of acceptance, along with the principles and rules of procedure, was published in the Lincoln Daily Star on May 28, 1918, the first day of the trial. These principles and rules of procedure include 10 points, the first of which states that, quote, the trial is in no way a criminal prosecution, unquote. And the manager is not, importantly, the manager is not, quote, in any sense a prosecutor of the charges before us, unquote. Included in the first point is the following clarification. Quote, the manager will seek neither a conviction nor an acquittal, but will earnestly endeavor to impartially put into your possession, that is, the Board of Regents, all the facts bearing on the general charge of disloyalty. The trial was not just a witch hunt, it turned into an ugly farce. In his final summation before the Board of Regents on June 12, 1918, Wilson had to apologize because he admitted he had had no time to review the so-called evidence brought against the professors and staff member. Quote, in several cases, witnesses have suggested the names of persons that should be investigated, and such persons have been cited to appear. And when the evidence against them was found to be trivial and unimportant, I now regret that I permitted these names to be brought before the public when no evidence could be produced of any disloyal conduct on their part. And I want here and now publicly to apologize to these persons for having permitted their names to be thus brought to public notice without having personally investigated the evidence which was supposed to exist against them, unquote. But this was hardly the worst of it. One would think that Wilson's apology would have humbled him, but that is not the case. After admitting that he had not investigated the evidence brought forth by the State Council of Defense before the trial began, Wilson went on the attack. Rather than abiding by the very principles he himself set down for the trial, that he would, as manager, not seek a conviction or acquittal. He violated his own rules and sought a conviction for 3 of the professors in a most vicious way. The 3 professors were Clark E. Persinger, George W.A. Luckey, and Irwin P. Haupt. Can you imagine the surprise of all 3 professors? No doubt they read Wilson's Principles and Rules of Procedure for the Trial in the Lincoln Daily Star. No doubt they adjusted their expectations to the belief that Wilson would not function as a prosecutor. They did not expect him, as manager of the trial, to argue for conviction or for acquittal. And yet here was Wilson on the last day of the trial arguing in the most strenuous way for their conviction. Since Wilson was acting on behalf of the Board of Regents, he could not have violated his own principles without the approval of the board. The professor's surprise must have been accompanied by the deepest sense of hurt, because halfway through the trial, the state council itself withdrew the charge of disloyalty since it could not be proven, and settled for the charge of exhibiting behavior that was, quote, negative, halting, or hesitating in support of the government, unquote. Yet Wilson, in a summary argument, charged all 3 not only with disloyalty but also with sedition. In relation to a critical remark Professor Luckey made that he wasn't convinced about the reason for going to war, Wilson stated that, quote, no more seditious remark ever fell from the lips of misguided, bigoted pacifism, unquote. In relation to Professor Persinger's supposed erratic behavior, Wilson quoted from a portion of Persinger's testimony and then made the following absurd statement, quote, I do not quote this testimony to show sedition or disloyalty to the government in time of war. I quote it for the purpose of showing that the respondent is a thoroughgoing scholastic heretic and that his unsoundness is not restricted to disloyalty to his country. I do not contend that every erratic man is disloyal, but on the other hand, every disloyal man is likely to be erratic, unquote. In relation to Professor Haupt, who is an avowed pacifist and would contribute money only to mercy funds like the Red Cross, Wilson had the following to say, quote, it is difficult for me to follow the processes of reason by which one brings himself in this age to believe in the doctrine of non-resistance. Such a doctrine is inconsistent with modern civilization and leads inevitably to the chaos of anarchy, unquote. Near the end of his summary argument for the expulsion of all 3 professors, Wilson thundered forth with perhaps the most outrageous claim made during the whole trial. Quote, I shall not contend that the 3 respondents, whose cases I have discussed, wished for the defeat of the American armies. I do not contend that they would purposely and deliberately do that which they knew would weaken the military forces of this country. However, this record shows beyond doubt that due to their erratic characteristics, to their peculiarities, their want of sympathy with the American cause, they have been contributing to the success of our enemies. No 3 private soldiers of all the millions in the ranks of our enemies had been able in the last year to do anything like the damage to the American cause that has been done by these 3 members of our university faculty. The whole tendency of the teaching, the philosophy, the language, and the conduct of these 3 men has been to hamstring the American forces and to take the punch and virility out of the young manhood of Nebraska, unquote. Wilson's outrageous claim was that a professor's criticism of the war was more harmful than American soldiers getting killed in the trenches. He offered no proof, of course, that dissent did indeed have the effect of interfering with recruitment, lowering the morale of armed forces, or contributing to the success of the enemy. Wilson clearly agreed with many federal court judges that took a broad interpretation of the Espionage Act that Jeffrey Stone refers to as the bad tendency construction. Any criticism of the war, even though it did not expressly advocate unlawful conduct, was considered unlawful because it might produce an adverse effect. It was not necessary to prove that it did have such an effect. All one had to do was claim that criticism might have a pernicious effect, to use a word dear to 100%ers, and that was sufficient to make it subject to the Espionage Act. As Jeffrey Stone points out, the United States during the war, quote, prosecuted more than 2,000 dissenters for allegedly disloyal, seditious, or incendiary speech. Rose Pastor Stokes, for an example, received a 10-year prison sentence for saying, quote, I am for the people and the government is for the profiteers, unquote. The effect of the Espionage Act and the even harsher Sedition Act was to terrorize Americans into silence about the war and how the Wilson administration was conducting the war. Although the Board of Regents did manage to conduct a trial open to the public and thus offered some legal protection to the accused professors and staff member, the fact that the State Council itself called numerous professors before its own investigation committee for interrogation, and that Henry H. Wilson during the trial violated the very principles he himself laid down, ultimately had the effect of extending the terror of super-patriotism to the university. The terror of super-patriotism during the war was not restricted just to acts of physical violence such as whippings, tars and featherings, confiscation of private property that was then sold for Liberty bonds, forcing people to kiss the flag, nailing flags to their homes, painting homes and churches with yellow stripes. Rather, terror also includes the deep fear that grips the soul when any expression of disagreement with the state can result in imprisonment or physical violence. 5 minutes? Thank you. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Last quote. Rather, terror also, the good example of this is Edwin Barbour, who is a professor of geology. I found this letter just wonderful. During the trial, he writes to Professor Elmore and says, quote, I am unable to come to any decision until Wednesday. You understand the trial, which was going on for many days, ends probably Tuesday evening. This, you understand, is a serious matter. I doubt it is wise to run the risk of adverse criticism which may arise from going into the field of fossils. I am pretty well scared out, as you can see, but before taking any risks, I shall have some letter from the Chancellor or Regents instructing me by letter. I feel that nothing else is safe. While collecting is right in itself, some might not think so. In other words, collecting fossils was a dubious activity, according to Professor Barbour, and I think I better close with that. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. Questions, please. I'm sorry. I know we don't have much time. Yes, John.
I'm curious whether the State Council of Defense was in fact an official state-funded organization, and likewise for the, is it not a patriotic Navy university?
Yeah, there was a patriotic league that was established. I think Professor Condra was the head of that, but also...
By the university?
I'm sorry, John?
Was that paid for by the university? Was that an official, or was that a private organization?
No, it was recognized. And one way, too, is, of course, if you didn't belong to it, then you were also suspect, right? Yep.
And I thought the same thing with the State Council of Defense. Was that an official Nebraska entity, or was that a private organization?
It was established legally through the legislature and signed into law, providing for that, right? That, yeah, giving this organization or council incredible power. That really do whatever it wanted to. I mean, I think, to mention Christian Sorensen again, Christian Sorensen was the lawyer who actually defended the Nonpartisan League because Metcalf wanted to shut them down in Nebraska because they had done very well in North Dakota and were coming down and organizing in Nebraska. And Sorensen put in an injunction to stop them from doing so. And there was a trial, I think, for about a week, and anyway, there was a compromise that was reached. But the important point was that taking the council to court was an important step to show that this council wasn't, all powerful. Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Following up on that, it's very interesting to hear a case in which the state is involved in prosecuting professors over matters that we would consider issues of academic freedom. Because today, at least, many of those organizations that in some way would like to monitor, censure what happens within universities and statements made by professors are more smaller or private organizations like Campus Watch or something like that. And another aspect that's central to attacks on academic freedom today tend to be geared towards education, in the sense that this is unacceptable because these are the people teaching our children, and that is the kind of central argument there, that this is not a matter of academic freedom but of public accountability because it's happening within the classroom. Was that an aspect of this trial? You cite mainly just kind of these professors as citizens or as individuals being attacked and not as educators.
That's a very good question, because Hartley Burr Alexander, professor whom I have great respect for, wrote a piece for The Nation at that time too. He ultimately sided with the decision on his part that yes, professors, right, do have and need to uphold a patriotic stance with regards to this issue. And so, very interesting question. The other part of this is that, unfortunately the AAUP was then just a very young organization. And although it had come out with its very strong, almost absolute principle of academic freedom, I think in 1915, by 1917 it knuckled under. In other words, I think the Committee on Academic Freedom During Wartime, I think, met in December of 1917, and by the end of December or early January of 1918, they completely knuckled under. In other words, they agreed that any criticism a professor made was the basis for dismissal. So.
You have another question. And that's that it's interesting for me to hear the terms like 100% Americanism, because of course that seems to come up very frequently, that those who are a pro-war faction or are outraged at this taking a pacifist stance at the time of war always claim that kind of terminology, if patriotism or 100% Americanism. And I was wondering if you thought oddly that there's something in this claim, and that those who are taking the side of pacifism are making a point to stand for ideals that are embodied in the Constitution, or that of the protection of life and of property, of free speech, of democracy, and that those actually trump for them some kind of abstract nationalism or obedience to an idea of nationalism, and that's where that rhetoric comes from. Because of course it's even applicable today, right? That the flag is used primarily as a symbol to kind of support, to indicate support for current elected government policies, and those that are pacifists don't tend to use the flag to say this is America, and this is patriotism.
Yes. I was surprised to find when you go back to. Of course, I haven't talked much in this about the Red Scare, of course, that followed immediately after the armistice. But the language that comes out at this point is just funnels directly into McCarthy during the 50s. The whole un-American committee, so it's I think the Espionage and the Sedition Act was removed, but I think there are elements still of the Espionage Act that are still in place. But as I said, part of what I want to do in the beginning with bringing up Jose Padilla is precisely that, how fragile all of this is and how easily you know, people can be painted as the other and then stripped of their rights. Yes?
Did the language issue come up during